The export controls were supposed to be the wall. That was the word officials used. A wall around America's most advanced semiconductor technology. And for about 18 months, Washington genuinely believed it had built one. It hadn't. In 2023, Huawei shipped a smartphone. That detail sounds mundane until you understand what was inside it. A 7-nanometer chip, domestically produced, from a company that had been cut off from every meaningful input it needed to make exactly that chip. The sanctions had been running for 3 years. The chip existed anyway, and the silence from Washington in the days after that phone went on sale was the kind of silence that means people are checking their assumptions. What happened between the policy announcement and that phone isn't a story about Chinese ingenuity outrunning American restrictions, though that's how most coverage framed it. It's a story about what the restrictions actually said versus what everyone assumed they said. Those are two different documents, and the gap between them was not an accident. Here's the part that took me a while to sit with. The Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, the office inside the Commerce Department responsible for export controls, issued its landmark rules in October 2022. Those rules were aggressive on paper. They targeted advanced chips, chip-making equipment, and critically, foreign nationals working in China's semiconductor sector. The policy community called it historic. Some called it a declaration of tech war. What they didn't call it, at least not publicly, was incomplete. Because running alongside the rulemaking process was something quieter, an 18-month lobbying effort by American semiconductor equipment companies, materials suppliers, and a cluster of firms whose revenue depended on continued access to Chinese customers. Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA Corporation. These are not household names, but they are the companies that build the machines that build the chips. And in 2020 and 2021, while the policy framework was still being drafted, their representatives were in rooms with BIS officials making a specific argument that overly broad controls would destroy American companies without actually stopping China, because China would simply source the technology elsewhere. That argument had merit. It also had a convenient conclusion. The result was a set of controls riddled with what trade lawyers started calling deemed export ambiguities, foreign-produced direct product carve-outs, and a licensing process so slow that by the time a violation was identified, the technology had already been absorbed. The wall had doors. Some of the doors had keys, and some of the keys had been distributed before the wall was even finished. We'll come back to the licensing backlog, because that number, when you see it, reframes this entire story. For now, understand this. By late 2021, China's state-linked procurement networks had already mapped the gaps. Not because they're omniscient, because the gaps were visible to anyone willing to read the Federal Register carefully enough, and Beijing employs people whose entire job is reading the Federal Register carefully. The sanctions were designed to prevent China from reaching the technological frontier. What they actually did was slow the timeline. The distinction matters more than any official wants to admit, because a delay is not a wall. A delay is a runway, and China used every month of it. There is a company called WingTech Technology. You probably haven't heard of it. That's the point. WingTech is officially a smartphone ODM, an original design manufacturer, the kind of firm that assembles devices for brands you do know. It is listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. It has a completely legitimate public profile. It also, through a subsidiary called Nexperia, controls a semiconductor fab in the Netherlands that it acquired in 2021, a facility that had previously operated under Philips, then NXP, building chips for the European automotive sector. The acquisition went through. European regulators reviewed it. The Dutch government raised concerns, eventually forced a partial divestiture, but the core facility and its institutional knowledge remained in Nexperia's hands long enough to matter. American export controls don't govern Dutch corporate acquisitions. That's not a loophole. That's a jurisdiction. And China's procurement strategy in 2020 and 2021 was, in substantial part, a systematic survey of jurisdictions. This is the mechanism the sanctions architects underestimated. Not smuggling, not cyber attacks on American chip designs, legitimate corporate transactions in third countries, conducted through entities with no visible connection to the Chinese state, purchasing technology and capability that predated the export control regime and therefore fell entirely outside it. The controls were forward-looking. China went shopping in the past. The specific provision that enabled this sits inside something called the Foreign Produced Direct Product Rule, the FDPR. When BIS expanded the FDPR in 2020 to cover Huawei, it created a framework that theoretically followed American technology anywhere in the world. If a foreign-made product used American software or fabrication equipment at any point in its production, it fell under U.S. jurisdiction. Aggressive in theory. The implementation had a different shape. The FDPR applied to products going to Huawei. It did not, at least not cleanly, apply to the acquisition of manufacturing capability by entities adjacent to Huawei's supply chain, but not formally connected to it. Corporate lawyers are very good at not formally connected. They billed a lot of hours in 2021. By the time BIS moved to close the most obvious versions of this gap in late 2022, the knowledge transfer had already occurred. Equipment had been relocated. Engineers had been hired, some of them through academic exchange programs that carried their own set of exemptions. The 2022 rules were written partly in response to transactions that had already settled. Policy was chasing practice, which is another way of saying policy was losing. Here is the number I promised to come back to. As of mid-2023, the BIS licensing backlog for semiconductor-related export applications sat at over 4,700 pending cases. The average processing time had stretched past 6 months. In an industry where process node generations turn over in 18 to 24 months, a 6-month licensing delay is not a security measure. It's an administrative inconvenience that companies learn to route around. Some applications were approved after the technology in question had already been superseded by a newer generation. The paperwork was filed on yesterday's chips, while tomorrow's were already in development. A former BIS official, not someone who wanted to be named, but someone whose title I'm deliberately not specifying because there are very few people it could be, described the staffing situation at the Enforcement Division in 2021 as structurally incapable of the mandate we were given. BIS had roughly 40 full-time staff dedicated to semiconductor-related enforcement at the time the October 2022 rules went into effect. China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology had entire departments analyzing those same rules, with budgets and timelines that did not answer to congressional appropriation cycles. That asymmetry is not a management failure. It's a reflection of how seriously each side took the contest. And then there's the third country problem, which is where the anger starts to become difficult to contain. Malaysia, Taiwan's second-tier suppliers, South Korean distributors. These are not adversary nations. They are trade partners with their own economic relationships and their own calculations about how aggressively to enforce an American regulatory framework that their own industries sometimes found inconvenient. Chips moved through these channels. Equipment moved. In some documented cases, American origin technology appeared in Chinese facilities within months of being exported to intermediary countries that had received no red flag guidance from Washington. The Commerce Department knew this was happening. There are internal memos, portions of which have been referenced in congressional testimony, though not fully declassified, that flagged third country transshipment as a primary enforcement gap as early as 2021. The memos were written. The gap remained open. Let me complicate my own argument for a moment, because the version of this story where Washington is simply asleep and Beijing is simply brilliant, that version is too clean, and clean versions of complicated failures are usually wrong about something important. The people who designed the October 2022 rules were not naive. Several of them had spent careers studying exactly this kind of evasion architecture. Alan Estevez, the Undersecretary of Commerce who oversaw the rulemaking, came from a defense procurement background. He understood supply chain substitution. The BIS team consulted with the intelligence community, with allied governments, with people who had watched Iran and Russia navigate sanctions regimes for decades. The rules they produced were, by the standards of export control history, genuinely ambitious. The problem was not ignorance. The problem was that the system those rules operated inside was built for a different era and a different adversary. America's export control architecture was designed in the 1970s and 1980s to manage technology transfer to the Soviet Union. The Soviet economy was largely closed. Its corporate sector was an arm of the state. The transaction chain was short. Soviet entity wants American technology. American company either sells it or doesn't. The choke point was obvious, and the enforcement, while imperfect, was at least aimed at the right target. China in 2021 was something the Cold War framework had no category for. A country simultaneously deeply integrated into the global trading system and strategically adversarial. A country whose private companies operated with genuine commercial independence while maintaining relationships with state priorities that were real but often undocumented. A country that had spent 30 years building redundant supply chains precisely because its leadership understood, after watching what happened to Japan's semiconductor industry in the 1980s, that technological dependency was a form of strategic vulnerability. Japan. That reference is not accidental, and it lands differently than most people expect it to. In 1986, the United States pressured Japan into the Semiconductor Trade Agreement, a deal that forced Japanese chip manufacturers to accept market share floors for American products and price floors on Japanese exports. The explicit goal was to slow Japan's dominance of the global memory chip market. It worked. Japanese semiconductor companies never fully recovered their competitive position. South Korean firms, particularly Samsung, filled the vacuum. Beijing watched that, studied it, taught it in policy schools. The entire logic of the Made in China 2025 initiative, launched in 2015, 7 years before the Biden export controls, was a direct institutional response to the lesson of Japan 1986. Build domestic capacity before the Americans decide you're too good at something. The sanctions didn't catch China building its wall. They arrived after the foundation was already poured. Here is where the reversal lives, and it reframes everything that came before it. The loophole China found in 2021 was not primarily a legal technicality, though legal technicalities were used. It was not primarily a staffing problem at BIS, though the staffing was inadequate. The fundamental gap was temporal. The export controls assumed they were responding to a capability China was still developing. In several critical areas, they were actually responding to a capability China had already transferred, already absorbed, already begun iterating on domestically. The restrictions landed on a target that had already moved. Specific example: ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, the EUV systems that are genuinely irreplaceable for sub-7 nanometer chip production, were already restricted from export to China before 2022. That restriction had been in place, under Dutch export law and American diplomatic pressure, since 2019. What was not restricted, until much later, was deep ultraviolet lithography, DUVI, the older generation of machines that, with enough engineering ingenuity and iteration cycles, can produce chips at process nodes that are commercially relevant even if they're not at the absolute frontier. SMIC, China's largest domestic chip maker, had acquired sufficient DUV equipment before the expanded restrictions took effect, enough to run what the industry calls multi-patterning, a technique that compensates for using older light sources by running the wafer through the exposure process multiple times. It's slower, it's more expensive per chip, it produces lower yields, and it produced the 7 nanometer chip inside the Huawei Mate 60 Pro that went on sale in August 2023, timed, and this timing was not coincidental. to the exact week that Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo landed in Beijing for diplomatic talks. Washington called the timing a provocation, which it was. It was also a demonstration. Those two things were the same message. The uncomfortable question, the one that congressional testimony has danced around without quite landing on, is whether closing the loopholes now actually changes the trajectory. Not the legal question, the physical one. The equipment is inside China. The engineers trained on it are inside China. The process knowledge, the yield data, the iteration cycles, all of it is accumulating inside facilities that American inspectors cannot enter and American law cannot reach. You can close a door after the room has already been furnished. In March 2024, a senior Commerce Department official testified before the Senate Banking Committee. The exchange that followed was not widely covered. It ran opposite a news cycle that had more photogenic problems. But one moment in the transcript is worth sitting with. Senator John Cornyn asked directly whether the United States had the enforcement capacity to prevent China from reaching advanced semiconductor self-sufficiency, given the current control framework. The official's answer ran for 4 paragraphs. It addressed multilateral coordination, allied engagement, the importance of the entity list, the progress on CHIPS Act funding. It was a complete non-answer delivered with total fluency. Cornyn didn't push back. The transcript moved on. That exchange is, in miniature, the entire problem. The question was answerable. The answer was no. The institution could not say no out loud, because saying no out loud would require explaining why, and the why involves decisions made between 2019 and 2022 that implicated people still in office, companies still receiving licenses, and a lobbying ecosystem that funds the campaigns of the committee members asking the questions. So the silence continues. And in the silence, SMIC runs another iteration cycle. My opinion, stated plainly, the October 2022 export controls were the right policy executed 4 years too late, staffed at 1/3 the level required, and undermined from inside the drafting process by industries whose quarterly earnings are structurally incompatible with national security objectives. The Biden administration deserves credit for moving further than any previous administration. It does not deserve credit for moving far enough. And the gap between those two things is where China's semiconductor program currently lives and is growing. The doubt I hold on to, and I think intellectual honesty requires holding it, is whether the alternative was achievable. A truly airtight control regime would have required pressuring Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands into enforcement postures that damaged their own semiconductor industries. It would have required BIS funding at a level Congress was not willing to approve. It would have required telling Applied Materials and Lam Research that their Chinese revenue was gone permanently, without compensation, for national security reasons. Democratic systems are not well designed for that kind of concentrated immediate pain in service of diffuse long-term security benefit. That's not an excuse. It's a structural observation about the kind of problem this actually is. The prediction, and I'll stand on it, by 2026, SMIC will demonstrate stable, repeatable 5-nanometer production using multi-patterning on DUV equipment. It will not match TSMC's yield rates. It will not be cost competitive for consumer electronics at scale, but it will be sufficient, that word, sufficient, for the specific chips that matter most to the Chinese military and to China's domestic AI infrastructure build-out. The frontier gap will remain. The sufficiency threshold will be crossed. And American policy will respond by adding more names to the entity list, which is the geopolitical equivalent of changing the locks after the tenant has already moved out and built a new house. The deeper thing this story is about, the thing underneath the process nodes and the licensing backlogs and the corporate lobbying, is a question about what economic interdependence actually costs when the relationship turns adversarial. America spent 30 years building a global technology supply chain that was efficient, profitable, and strategically catastrophic. The catastrophe is now visible. The unwinding is slower than the buildup, more painful, and happening on a timeline that China's planners are far more comfortable with than Washington's election cycles. One last thing. The Huawei Mate 60 Pro, the phone that started this specific chapter of the story, sold out within hours of its release. Chinese consumers understood what they were buying, not just a smartphone, a signal. The sanctions were supposed to make that signal impossible. They made it expensive. That's different. If you've stayed this far, you already know this story doesn't end here. Subscribe so you're there when the next chapter forces Washington to answer the question it keeps avoiding.